What if I told you that a scientist who spent 15 years studying rock formations and mocking near-death experiences would become living proof that consciousness survives death? I was that skeptic, a professional geologist who lived by facts, data, and measurable phenomena. I was an atheist who ridiculed anyone claiming to see tunnels of light or meet deceased relatives. But what happened to me during 8 minutes of clinical death shattered everything I thought I knew about reality. My name is Marcus, I'm 42 years old, and until March 15, 2019, I was the kind of scientist who demanded proof for everything. With a PhD in geological sciences from Stanford and dozens of published research papers, I prided myself on being a man of pure logic. Death, to me, was simple. Lights out, brain stops, game over. Nothing more than electrical impulses ceasing. When the body fails, I remember laughing at my colleague Sarah when she told me about her grandmother's deathbed vision of angels. "Sarah," I said, shaking my head, "your grandmother was dying. Her brain was shutting down. What she saw was nothing more than neurons misfiring." I was so arrogant, so certain in my materialistic worldview. If I couldn't measure it, weigh it, or analyze its chemical composition, it simply didn't exist. My life was predictable, comfortable. I'd wake up at 5:30 a.m., review seismic data over coffee, spend my days in the field collecting rock samples, and evenings writing reports. I lived in a small apartment filled with geological specimens, each one perfectly catalogued and labeled. My world made sense. Everything had an explanation rooted in observable, testable phenomena. But in 8 minutes of clinical death, I discovered I was catastrophically wrong about everything. What I experienced in that time will challenge everything you think you know about life, death, and what lies beyond. I was driving home from a field site in Northern California, my truck loaded with core samples from a potential mining operation. The mountain roads were familiar to me. I'd driven them hundreds of times over the years. The sun was setting, painting the rocky cliffs in shades of amber and gold. I was thinking about the interesting mineral formations I'd discovered that day, already planning my analysis back at the lab. That's when it happened. A semi-truck driver, later investigation would reveal, had fallen asleep at the wheel. I saw the massive vehicle drift into my lane, but there was nowhere to go. The mountain drop-off on my right, solid rock face on my left. Time slowed to a crawl as 18 wheels of steel barreled toward me at 70 miles per hour. The impact was catastrophic. The sound of crushing metal and shattering glass filled the air as my truck was compressed like a tin can. I felt my body being thrown around the cab like a rag doll, my seatbelt snapping under the tremendous force. Then everything went black. What I experienced next defied every law of physics I had ever studied, every principle of neuroscience I thought I understood. I found myself floating above the wreckage, looking down at my own broken body, trapped in the twisted metal. I could see the paramedics working frantically, shouting medical terms I recognized from my first aid training. One of them was checking for a pulse, while another prepared a defibrillator. I watched as they pulled my lifeless form from the wreckage, blood covering my face and chest. But here's what shook me to my core. I could see everything with perfect clarity, even though my physical eyes were closed. I could hear their conversations, feel their urgency, observe details from multiple angles simultaneously. This wasn't a hallucination or a dream. My consciousness was fully aware, more alert than I had ever been in my physical body, watching my own death unfold below me. Then suddenly I was moving upward, away from the accident scene, not flying exactly, but being drawn by a force I couldn't understand. The familiar landscape of Northern California began to fade as I ascended through what seemed like layers of reality I never knew existed. That's when I entered what I can only describe as the third heaven. The transition was instantaneous, yet gentle. One moment I was floating above the earthly scene of my accident. The next, I was standing in a realm of indescribable beauty and light. The very air shimmered with an energy that penetrated every part of my being. This wasn't the harsh, clinical light of a hospital room or the warm glow of sunlight. This was living light, light that pulsed with love, with knowledge, with the very essence of creation itself. The landscape before me defied every geological principle I had ever learned. Imagine a master jeweler's workshop where God himself crafts reality. That's the closest I can come to describing what surrounded me. Crystal formations stretched toward infinite skies. But these weren't the minerals I knew from Earth. They sang with harmonic frequencies that resonated through my entire essence, like a cosmic symphony played on instruments made of pure light. Rivers of liquid light flowed through valleys of what appeared to be precious stones, each one more radiant than the finest diamonds I had ever examined in my laboratory. But here's what shook me as a scientist. When I focused on any single element, it would respond to my attention, growing brighter, more beautiful, as if the very act of observation enhanced its reality. Mountains rose in the distance, but they seemed to be made of condensed starlight, shifting and flowing while maintaining their majestic structure. The very ground beneath my feet felt alive, responsive to my thoughts and emotions. When I stepped forward, trails of golden light followed my movements, creating patterns of impossible beauty that spoke directly to my soul. What does this mean for everything we think we know about reality? If consciousness can shape matter at this level, what are we truly capable of in our earthly existence? But the most overwhelming aspect wasn't what I saw, it was what I felt. Love. Imagine every moment you've ever felt loved, by a parent, a spouse, a friend, and multiply that by infinity. That's still not even close. This wasn't human love, limited by emotion or circumstance. This was the fundamental force that holds the universe together, the energy that creates and sustains all life. I felt known, completely and utterly known, in a way that stripped away every pretense, every fear, every doubt I had ever carried. It was like being a drop of water finally returning to the ocean, suddenly aware that I had never been separate from this vast, loving consciousness, only temporarily forgotten my true nature. As I stood there absorbing this incredible reality, I became aware that I wasn't alone. Beings of light began to appear around me, not human figures exactly, but conscious entities radiating wisdom and compassion beyond anything I could comprehend. Their presence was both humbling and comforting, like being welcomed home after a lifetime of wandering in the wilderness. One being approached me, and though it spoke no words, I understood its communication perfectly. Knowledge flowed between us like electricity through a conductor. I was shown the interconnectedness of all existence, how every atom, every planet, every galaxy was part of an intricate web of divine consciousness. The materialistic worldview I had clung to for 42 years crumbled as I witnessed the spiritual reality underlying all physical phenomena. I was taken to what I can only call a great library, though it bore no resemblance to any earthly structure. Think of it as the internet of the universe. But instead of clicking links, knowledge flowed directly into my consciousness. Instead of books, knowledge existed as living entities of light that I could experience directly. The history of the universe unfolded before me, not just the scientific timeline I had studied, but the spiritual purpose behind creation itself. The being of light showed me the earth from this higher perspective, and I wept at its beauty. Our planet glowed with life force, connected to countless other worlds through streams of divine energy. Every human being, every animal, every plant was revealed as a unique expression of the same universal consciousness. What struck me most painfully was seeing how the wars, hatred, and divisions plaguing our world were nothing but tragic illusions, like watching people fight over shadows. while standing in brilliant sunlight, completely unaware of the light surrounding them. Then I was shown something that changed my understanding of death itself. I witnessed the arrival of souls who had just left their physical bodies, and I saw the joy of their reunion with this realm of love. Death, I realized, wasn't an ending, but a homecoming. The fear I had carried my entire life, the fear that motivated my desperate clinging to materialistic explanations, simply evaporated in the face of this greater truth. But perhaps most profound was when I encountered what I can only describe as the source of all existence. Not an old man with a beard sitting on a throne, but a presence so vast, so loving, so infinitely creative that my expanded consciousness could barely comprehend it. In that presence, I understood that every question I had ever asked about the meaning of life, about suffering, about purpose, had the same answer: love. This wasn't sentimental emotion, but the fundamental creative force of existence. I saw how this love had spoken the universe into being, how it sustained every star and galaxy, how it reached into the hearts of every conscious being throughout creation. The cynical, atheistic professor who had entered that hospital bed was dissolving in the light of absolute truth. I was shown my own life from this perspective, not just the external events, but the spiritual significance of every experience. I saw how moments of suffering had been opportunities for growth, how challenges had been invitations to develop compassion and strength. Even my materialistic phase was revealed as a necessary part of my soul's journey, preparing me for this moment of ultimate awakening. The being of light communicated that I had a choice. I could remain in this realm of perfect love and understanding, or I could return to my physical body and share what I had experienced. As I contemplated this decision, I felt a pull toward the people in my earthly life, my sister who was struggling with depression, my students who were hungry for meaning beyond their textbooks, my colleague Sarah, whom I had mocked for her spiritual beliefs. I realized that my experience, as profound as it was for me personally, carried a responsibility. I had been given a gift of ultimate truth, and with that gift came the obligation to help others understand that death is not the end, that love is the foundation of reality, and that every human life has infinite value and purpose. The transition back was gentle but sudden. One moment I was basking in the light of divine presence. The next, I was aware of harsh fluorescent lights above a hospital bed. The contrast was jarring, from the indescribable beauty of the third heaven to the sterile, clinical environment of the ICU. But what struck me most was how different everything felt. The fear was gone. The desperate need to understand and control everything through scientific analysis had been replaced by a deep peace and knowing. I was still Marcus, still a geologist, but I was so much more. I had been shown the reality behind reality, and nothing would ever be the same. But here's what will completely reframe everything you think you know about life and death. When I woke up in that hospital bed, I wasn't the same man. The scientific part of my brain was fighting what my soul had experienced. How could someone who spent 30 years studying rock formations and geological evidence suddenly believe in heaven? How could an atheist professor who had mocked religious students in my lectures now be claiming he'd seen the third heaven? But the memory was too vivid, too real. I could still feel the overwhelming love that had surrounded me. I could still see those crystalline structures that defied every law of physics I'd ever taught. And most troubling of all, I could still hear the warnings I'd received about what was coming to our world. The nurses thought I was delirious. My colleagues thought I'd suffered brain damage from the lack of oxygen. But deep inside, I knew something extraordinary had happened to me, something that would change not just my life, but my understanding of reality itself. In those first few days of recovery, I found myself doing something I'd never done before. I started reading the Bible. not as a skeptic looking for contradictions, but as someone desperately seeking answers. And that's when I discovered that what I'd experienced wasn't unique, it wasn't new. The Apostle Paul had been there too. In 2 Corinthians chapter 12, he writes about being caught up to the third heaven, the very same realm I had visited. He speaks of hearing inexpressible things, things that man is not permitted to tell. But here's what struck me. Paul also struggled with whether to speak about his experience. He knew people would think he was crazy. I understood that struggle. For weeks, I wrestled with what to do with this knowledge. Do I go back to teaching geology and pretend nothing happened? Do I return to my atheistic worldview and dismiss this as a hallucination? Or do I accept that everything I thought I knew about reality was fundamentally wrong? The turning point came 3 weeks after the accident. I was alone in my study, surrounded by geology textbooks and scientific journals, trying to make sense of what had happened. That's when I felt it again. That same presence I'd encountered in the third heaven. It wasn't as intense as before, but it was unmistakably real, and in that moment I received what I can only describe as a download of information, not through words or images, but through pure understanding that flooded my consciousness. I saw patterns emerging in world events that connected directly to the warnings I'd received during my near-death experience. Here's something that will make you reconsider everything about timing and divine planning. The year 2025 wasn't chosen randomly for these revelations. As I began to research with my newfound spiritual awareness, I discovered that the famous prophet Nostradamus had written extensively about this exact time period. Century 2, Quatrain 28 speaks of a time when the last discovery will be made by the solar man. And as someone who had just discovered the solar nature of consciousness itself, this gave me chills. Century 1, Quatrain 48 mentions 20 years of the reign of the moon ending, which scholars place exactly in 2025. But here's where it gets truly mind-bending. It wasn't just Nostradamus. Ancient Mayan calendars, biblical prophecies, even the geological data from my own field, everything pointed to this moment as a crucial turning point. It was like discovering that multiple civilizations across time had been given pieces of the same cosmic puzzle. Think about what this means. If ancient prophets could see this time period with such clarity, what does that tell us about the nature of time itself? The beings of light had told me that humanity was approaching a crossroads. Imagine standing at a fork in the road where one path leads to a garden and the other to a wasteland. We could continue down the path of materialism and separation, or we could awaken to our true spiritual nature. They showed me that the chaos and uncertainty we're experiencing now, the political upheaval, the social division, the spiritual hunger that so many people feel, these aren't random events. They're birth pangs of a new consciousness being born. Like a butterfly struggling to emerge from its cocoon, here's where my geological background became crucial. I was shown how the Earth itself is shifting energetically. The increased seismic activity, the unusual weather patterns, even the magnetic pole shifts, they're all symptoms of a larger transformation happening not just to our planet, but to our entire solar system. What if the Earth's changes and humanity's spiritual awakening aren't separate phenomena, but part of the same cosmic upgrade? What shocked me most was learning that this information was being given to people all around the world. I wasn't some chosen prophet. I was part of a vast awakening. Doctors, engineers, physicists, people from every field were receiving similar revelations. We were like agents being activated for humanity's most crucial mission. The prophecies, embedded in Nostradamus' work, speak of a time when the earth will tremble with a new vibration, and men will become as gods, knowing good and evil perfectly. As someone who had experienced that godlike consciousness in the third heaven, I knew this wasn't metaphorical language. It's describing an actual elevation of human consciousness that's happening right now. Century 10, Quatrain 74 reads, "The year of the great seventh number accomplished, it will appear at the time of the games of slaughter, not far from the great millennial age, when the buried will go out from their tombs." Scholars place this in 2025, and after witnessing the spiritual realm, where consciousness never dies, I understood what the buried going out from their tombs really meant. Have you noticed how many people are suddenly talking about spiritual experiences, consciousness, and awakening? You're witnessing this prophecy unfold in real time. But here's what the beings of light made absolutely clear. These prophecies aren't set in stone. They're warnings and possibilities designed to help us make better choices. The future I was shown can be changed if enough people awaken to their spiritual nature and choose love over fear. I was shown two possible futures for humanity, like watching two movies play simultaneously. In one timeline, we continue to be driven by ego, materialism, and separation. Imagine our current divisions amplified tenfold, leading to increasing chaos, environmental destruction, and spiritual darkness. But in the other timeline, humanity undergoes a massive spiritual awakening. People begin to remember their divine nature, like amnesiacs suddenly recalling who they really are. Science and spirituality merge into a unified understanding of reality, exactly what's beginning to happen now. Here's the profound part. The choice between these timelines isn't made by governments or leaders. It's being made right now by each individual who hears this message. Every person who chooses to open their heart, to forgive instead of hold grudges, to love instead of fear, they're casting a vote for the positive timeline. What timeline are you choosing with your thoughts and actions today? This is why I had to share my story, despite knowing many would think I'd lost my mind. Remember what I promised you at the beginning, that a scientist who spent 15 years mocking near-death experiences would become living proof that consciousness survives death. That promise has been fulfilled. The former atheist professor, who once ridiculed spiritual experiences, now stands before you as that living proof. I'm like a messenger returning from a country that most people don't believe exists. But I've brought back proof. You've witnessed my complete transformation, from materialistic skeptic to spiritual witness. The 8 minutes of clinical death that should have ended my story became the beginning of my greatest discovery. The transformation I experienced wasn't just personal, it was preparation for a mission. I now understand that my background in geology, my training in scientific method, my years as a skeptic, were all preparing me for this moment, to serve as a bridge between two worlds that have been artificially separated. Think about it. What if science and spirituality aren't opposing forces, but like two hands of the same body, designed to work together to help humanity grasp the fullness of reality? But here's the most important question of all. Think about what this means for your own life. You've just witnessed scientific proof that consciousness survives death, that higher dimensions exist, and that we're living in prophetic times. How does this revelation change everything about how you live? Each day, the beings of light told me something that still gives me chills. Everyone who hears this message was chosen to hear it. You weren't led to my testimony by accident. Your soul is being called to awaken, like an alarm clock going off in the depths of your consciousness, reminding you who you really are. Remember, love is the force that moves the universe. This isn't just a spiritual platitude. It's the fundamental truth I witnessed in the third heaven, the reality that transforms lives and shapes destinies. You're not just watching a video, you're receiving an invitation to play your part in the greatest spiritual awakening in human history. The question is, will you accept it? What you've received today, this testimony from a former skeptic who experienced clinical death and returned with proof, is your invitation to join this awakening. I invite you to share your own experiences in the comments below. Have you had dreams or visions about the future? Have you felt a spiritual awakening happening in your own life? Have you noticed the signs and patterns I've described? Your story matters. By sharing it, you help others understand that they're not alone in this transformation. You become part of the living proof that consciousness transcends death and that love truly is the force that moves the universe. As someone who once demanded scientific evidence for everything, I'm telling you, the evidence is here. The awakening is real. The choice is yours. Choose love. Choose awakening. Choose to be part of the solution. The future of humanity depends on the choices we make right here, right now, and you have the power to choose the timeline of hope.